Ethan Wilson, 38, knelt on the maple floor of his Denver, Colorado, living room. The laser level in his right hand cast a thin red line on the wood paneling of a built-in cabinet. Sweat trickled down his forehead, but Ethan ignored it, focused on the alignment. His jeans were covered in fine shavings, and his gray t-shirt was stuck to his back. In his left pocket was a pencil, using it to mark anchor points. This renovation, his project for the past 2 months, was a distraction from his job at a cybersecurity startup, where he developed code to protect data for big companies. The living room looked almost finished. The shelves he'd installed last week fit neatly into the corner of the dark slate fireplace. Matte black light fixtures hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over the room. Ethan sat back on his heels, looking around the space. He imagined Lindsay, his wife, looking at the results, maybe even smiling like she used to. She was rarely home these days, spending time at the fashion company where she worked as a senior brand manager. Ethan had grown accustomed to her absences, but he still waited for her to return, cooking dinner or leaving the light on in the entryway. He slid under the console table to tighten the bolt on the bottom mount. His fingers were working the wrench deftly when the front door clicked shut. Ethan froze at the sound of Lindsay's voice, confident, with the slight playfulness she used to charm the person she was talking to. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, her steps approaching the kitchen adjacent to the living room. "No, I'm just staying," the other woman said. Ethan recognized Mia, Lindsay's younger sister, a 29-year-old artist who always sounded a little casual. "Just stopping by to see how your collection was going." Ethan was about to climb out and say hello, but something in Mia's tone made him pause. He pressed the wrench against the bolt, trying not to make a sound. "Oh, it's all good," Lindsay said, and Ethan heard her set her cup down on the marble countertop. "The presentation is in a week, and if all goes well, I'll get the creative director job." "Really? That's a huge step." Mia laughed. "And what, have you already told Ethan that you're leaving as soon as you sign the contract?" Ethan froze, holding his breath, afraid he'd miss a word. "No way," Lindsay said, her voice quieter but still clear. She laughed, short, almost mockingly. "I need to collect my bonus and half of our bills first. Then I'll figure it out." "Are you sure he doesn't notice?" Mia asked, her tone becoming more serious. "Ethan's not stupid." "Ethan?" Lindsay snorted. "He's like a naive child." Ethan felt the blood rush to his temples. His mind screamed at him to get out, but years in the army had taught him to control his impulses. He remained still, listening. "What about Caleb?" Mia continued. "Does he know you're planning on leaving Ethan?" Ethan gritted his teeth. Caleb was a designer at Lindsay's firm. He remembered Caleb talking too long to Lindsay at the company party last year. Ethan had dismissed it as nothing. "Caleb knows," Lindsay said, her voice becoming businesslike. "He's waiting for me to get the job. Then we can start over. Ethan won't even know what happened." "That's pretty harsh, Lynn," Mia said, a note of doubt in her voice. "Even for you." "It's not personal, Mia," Lindsay snapped. "It's calculation. Life is a struggle, and if you want to get more and better, you have to play hardball. There's no place for the weak here." "Ethan will cope, he always does. We hardly talk. The love has long since faded. He is in his world, I am in mine, and nothing connects us anymore." Ethan heard them move toward the couch in the lounge area. Their voices were lower, but Lindsay's words echoed in his head. "Not personal, settlement, half the bill." He exhaled slowly. 6 years of marriage, his giving up his job in San Francisco to make her career, the countless nights waiting for her with dinner, she now called it settlement. In making concessions, he had wasted years denying himself what every man dreams of: ambition, the chance to make his mark, and the children she had promised him, but kept putting off until his hopes were nothing but empty air. He remembered the day they bought the house. Lindsay had stood in the empty living room, her eyes shining as she talked about the big window overlooking the Rocky Mountains. "This is where our life is going to be, Ethan," she'd said, hugging him. They'd laughed as they planned where they'd put the tree for Christmas. Ethan tightened the bolt carefully, the movements mechanical. He climbed out from under the table, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and looked around the living room. The fireplace, the shelves, the light fixtures, everything he had built for them. The footsteps returned. Lindsay and Mia entered the living room, Lindsay holding her phone, checking her messages. "We need to finish the cabinets," Ethan said, his voice level, as if he hadn't heard their conversation. Lindsay looked up, startled. "Oh, Ethan, I didn't know you were here." She smiled, but her gaze was cool, professional. "Mia just came by to chat." "Hey, Mia," Ethan nodded, looking at her. Mia looked away, fiddling with the strap of her bag. "Hey," she murmured. "The living room looks great. You're doing great." "Thank you," Ethan said, his tone neutral. "I've always liked working with my hands." Lindsay looked at her watch. "I thought you were at the hardware store." "I already did," Ethan replied, placing the level on the table. "I'll finish here, and then we can have dinner." "Oh, I have to go to the office," Lindsay said, adjusting her sweater. "Presentation for the new line needs to be finished by Monday." "I see," Ethan said, looking into her eyes. "Don't be late." "I'll come with you," Mia said, heading for the door. "Ethan, I'll see you. Don't wait for Lynn, she might be out late." Ethan nodded, turning back to the tools. He began to lay them out places, each screw and key in its own compartment in the drawer. The door closed, and silence filled the house. Ethan froze, holding the screwdriver. He looked at his palms, calloused and caked with wood dust. These hands had built their home, their life. Now he had to find a way to protect it. He returned the screwdriver to the drawer, closed it, and headed for the stairs. Lindsay wasn't going to get what she wanted. Not that easy. Ethan Wilson sat at his desk in the second-floor office of their Denver home. His laptop screen cast a bluish glow across the room, illuminating the lines of code he was pretending to be working on. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. His fingers rested on the keyboard, but he wasn't typing. Instead, he listened to the sounds of the house, waiting for Lindsay to return. She'd gone to the studio after their conversation in the living room, promising to be back for dinner, but the clock ticked and she still hadn't returned. Ethan was used to her late arrivals, but today, after what he'd heard earlier in the day, every tick of the clock added to the tension. The front door clicked. Ethan sat up straight, his eyes darting to the office door. Lindsay's footsteps, light but sure, echoed down the hallway. He heard her toss her bag onto the table by the door, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Then there was silence, as if she'd paused to check her phone or look around. Ethan forced himself to press a few keys to keep the screen from going blank and pretended to be immersed in his work. The office door opened slightly. Lindsay peered inside, silhouetted by the light from the hallway lamp. She was wearing the black dress she wore to client meetings, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She smelled of something strong, men's cologne, not his. "Are you still awake?" she asked, her voice tired but with a hint of irritation. Ethan looked up, his expression neutral. "Yes, a security bug. We need to figure it out before morning." She nodded, leaning against the door frame. "The presentation ran long today. I barely got away." "A lot of work?" Ethan asked, looking at her. He noticed her fingers fiddling with the strap of her watch, a habit she had when she was nervous. "Same as usual," Lindsay replied with a shrug. "Clients, edits, that kind of thing. I'm dead tired." "I see," Ethan said, turning back to the screen. "Go to bed. I'll be done soon." "Don't stay too long," she said, already turning around. "Tomorrow is a hard day." "Aha," Ethan muttered, not looking up. He heard her footsteps retreat toward the bedroom and the door close quietly. Ethan waited a moment, listening. Silence. He leaned back in his chair, his hands curling into fists. The cologne, her words about the presentation, her eyes evasive when she talked about work. It all added up to a picture he couldn't ignore after the conversation he'd overheard earlier that day. Lindsay was planning to leave with half their money, and she was already with Caleb. Ethan felt anger rise in his chest, but his military training won out. He wouldn't storm into the bedroom, wouldn't yell. He'd be smarter. He opened his browser and logged into their online banking. Lindsay had never cared about her finances, trusting him with them. Now that trust was to his advantage. Ethan typed in the password, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The home page of their joint account appeared. Balance. He clicked on transaction history, scrolling through the last 6 months. At first, everything seemed normal. Electric bills, mortgage, streaming subscription. But then he noticed a few unusual transactions. A $500 withdrawal 3 weeks ago. Another for $300 a week later. Lindsay had explained the spending as client meetings, but Ethan had never asked for details. Now he wished he had. He clicked on another tab, their credit card. There was an $820 purchase at Vespra, a restaurant in downtown Denver they'd never gone to together. The date, last Thursday, when Lindsay had said she was running late for a meeting. A meeting, huh? Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. He took a screenshot of the transaction and saved it to a folder on his desktop that he simply called Documents. He scrolled to their investment portfolio. There were surprises there, too. A $2,000 transfer to an unknown account 2 months ago. Lindsay hadn't mentioned it. Ethan clicked on the transfer details, but the account was in her name with a different bank. His jaw tightened. He took another screenshot, adding it to the folder. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his eyes. His mind was working like debugging code. Find a bug, analyze it, fix it. But this wasn't software. This was his life. He remembered how Lindsay had screwed up a big project 2 years ago and almost gotten fired. She'd come home crying, saying she'd let the team down. Ethan had sat with her until midnight, telling her she could handle it, helping her formulate a plan to convince her boss to give her a second chance. Then she'd looked at him gratefully, her hand squeezing his. When had Lindsay disappeared? When had she decided their marriage was just a deal? He wanted to get up, go to the bedroom, wake her, and demand answers. His fingers tightened on the edge of the table, his nails digging into the wood. But he stopped. There was no point in screaming. She would lie, like she had about the restaurant, about the meetings, about Caleb. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He had to be smarter, cooler. He opened another account, their savings account, for a vacation they were planning next year. Balance, $45,671. Ethan scrolled through the history. Another withdrawal, wanting $200 a month ago. Lindsay said it was for a gift for a coworker. He hadn't specified, busy with a deadline at work. Now he knew that was a lie. He saved another screenshot. A gift, he said quietly, his voice shaking with anger. Of course. Ethan went to their retirement accounts. Everything was in order, no unexpected movements. But he made a copy of everything anyway, saving it in the same folder. He knew this was just the beginning. If Lindsay was planning on taking half, she'd already started moving money around. He needed to find it all. The clock read 1:15 am. Ethan heard Lindsay stir in the bedroom, the creak of the bed, footsteps toward the bathroom. He quickly minimized the finance windows and opened a code editor to make the screen appear functional. The office door opened again. Ethan, are you serious? Lindsay said, her voice hoarse with sleep. She was standing in her pajamas, her hair down. It's 1 in the morning. Almost finished, he replied without looking at her. Just a couple more lines to finish. You're unbearable, she sighed, shaking her head. Go to bed already, or you'll be like a zombie tomorrow. Soon, Ethan said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Go to bed. She looked at him for a second, then closed the door. Ethan waited until her footsteps faded. He opened the evidence folder, scanning the screenshots. Each one was a punch. $500, $820, $2,000. He imagined Lindsay and Caleb at Vespra, laughing while he sat at home, fixing cabinets. His fists clenched, but he forced himself to focus. Ethan opened his email and wrote a quick note to his army friend, Jack, who knew a private investigator. Need help. Someone who can dig deep. Confidential. He sent the message, closed the email, and turned back to finance. He spent another hour copying data from every account, credit cards, savings, investments. By 2:30 a.m., his eyes were burning with fatigue, but he couldn't stop. He found one more transaction, $600 for a hotel in Denver, the night Lindsay was supposedly at an off-site meeting. He saved a screenshot, his fingers shaking. Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. The silence of the house was oppressive. He glanced at the photograph on his desk. He and Lindsay in Italy 3 years ago. She was laughing, her hand on his shoulder. He remembered her saying, "You're my home, Ethan." The words seemed empty now. He wanted to believe she was still Lindsay, but the evidence on his screen said otherwise. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out into the dark yard. The Rocky Mountains were barely visible, were visible in the night. Ethan gripped the windowsill, his mind racing. He wouldn't let her walk away with half their lives. Not after building this house, their future. He walked back to the desk, opened his laptop, and began making a list. Accounts to check, passwords to change, steps to take. Ethan Wilson woke up at 6:32 a.m. as sunlight streamed through the blinds of their Denver bedroom. He lay on his side of the bed, looking at the empty half where Lindsay should have been. She'd gotten home late, after midnight, and now her pillow was rumpled, her blanket thrown back. Ethan rubbed his eyes, tired from a night spent on his laptop digging through their finances. Suspicious spending $820 for a restaurant, $2,000 to an unknown account still burned in his mind. He stood, pulled on jeans and a gray t-shirt, and headed downstairs to the kitchen. The coffee maker sat on the marble counter, its metal frame catching the morning light. Ethan dropped in the beans, poured in the water, and turned on the machine. As the machine hissed, he pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, a habit he'd gotten into, even though he knew Lindsay would likely leave early. The kitchen was clean, the dishwasher humming quietly as it finished its cycle. A magnet from their trip to Italy hung on the refrigerator, next to a note that read, "Buy milk." Ethan looked at the note, in Lindsay's handwriting, and clenched his jaw. Her words, overheard yesterday, settlement, half the bill, Caleb, echoed in his head. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Lindsay walked into the kitchen, already dressed for pilates. Black leggings, a sports bra, her hair pulled back into a high ponytail. Her face was fresh, but there were dark circles under her eyes, hidden by light makeup. She dropped her gym bag on a chair and picked up her phone, checking her messages. "Good morning," Ethan said, pouring coffee into his mug. His voice was even, though inside he was fighting the urge to ask where she had been yesterday. "Morning," Lindsay replied, not looking up from the screen. "Is the coffee ready?" "Yes," Ethan said, gesturing toward the coffee maker. "Would you like some?" "I can handle it," she said, walking over to the counter. She poured coffee, added almond milk from the fridge, and took a sip. "Damn, it's hot." Ethan watched her, noticing how she avoided his gaze. "Plans for the day?" he asked, leaning on the table. "Pilates, then lunch with Kate," Lindsay replied, setting down her mug. "She's in town for a couple of days. We should meet up." Ethan nodded, even though he knew it was a lie. Lindsay's college friend Kate was on vacation in Mexico. He'd seen her post on social media 2 days ago. He took a sip of coffee, hiding his anger. "Sounds good. Where are you having lunch?" "We haven't decided yet," Lindsay said with a shrug. "Maybe Harvest. They have a new chef." She glanced at her watch. "I have to go. Class is in half an hour." "Good luck," Ethan said, his tone neutral. "Don't overexert yourself." Lindsay smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "Thank you. What are you doing?" "The cabinet's in the living room," he replied, putting his mug in the sink. "I want to finish by this evening." "Cool," she said, grabbing her bag. "See you later." "Yeah," Ethan muttered, watching her walk out of the kitchen. The garage door slammed, and a minute later her car started. He walked to the window, watching her black SUV pull out onto the street. Only when the car disappeared around the corner did he exhale. Ethan returned to the kitchen, poured more coffee, and walked to his office on the second floor. The room was small, with a wooden desk, two monitors, and a shelf filled with programming books. He sat down, opened his laptop, and went to the documents folder where he kept screenshots of yesterday's findings. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Anger at Lindsay's lies, palates, lunch with Kate, mingled with cold determination. He felt like a traitor for going behind her back. But her words, "It's not personal, it's calculation," justified him. He pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer, Greg Thompson, whom he had met through a colleague at work. Greg answered on the second ring. "Ethan, good morning," Greg said, his voice cheerful. "How can I help you?" "I need advice," Ethan said, looking at his laptop screen. "Confidential. About family finances." "Got it," Greg replied, his tone becoming more serious. "What happened?" "Nothing concrete yet," Ethan said, choosing his words carefully. "I want to protect my assets, in case of unforeseen situations." "That makes sense," Greg said. "We can meet Monday at 10 a.m. Is that okay?" "Yes," Ethan said. "What do you need me to bring?" "Account statements, investments, real estate," Greg listed. "Anything to do with your finances, I'll see how to protect your share." "Thanks, Greg," Ethan said. "See you Monday." "Hang in there," Greg said, and the connection went dead. Ethan put the phone down and opened his email. There was a reply from Jack, his friend from the Army he had written to the night before. "Detective Reynolds. Reliable, clean. His number is 303-555-8923. Call and tell him it's from me." Ethan dialed the number. "Reynolds," a deep voice answered after the third ring. "This is Ethan Wilson," Ethan said. "Jack recommended you. I need help." "What kind?" Reynolds asked, his tone businesslike. "Surveillance," Ethan said, lowering his voice even though he was alone. "My wife. I want to know who she's seeing, where she's going, what accounts she's using." "Got it," Reynolds said. "It's not cheap. $200 an hour, plus expenses. Agreed?" "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "When can you start?" "Today, if you give me the details," Reynolds replied. "Name, photo, habits, places you go." "I'll send it in an hour," Ethan said. "We need proof. Photos, transcripts, anything you can find." "Will do," Reynolds said. "Send it to this number, encrypt it if you're paranoid." "Thank you," Ethan said, ending the call. He opened his messenger, selected a photo of Lindsay from their vacation last year. She was in a white dress, smiling against a backdrop of mountains. His finger hovered over the send button. He remembered Lindsay helping him write his resume after the Army when he wasn't sure how to launch a career in tech. She'd sat with him at the kitchen table, highlighting his skills, assuring him he could do it. They'd been a team then. Now she was lying to his face. Ethan sent the photo, adding the caption, "Lindsay Wilson, 35, works at a fashion company, often in downtown Denver, drives a black Lexus RX." The next call was to the bank. Ethan dialed the helpline, his fingers tapping on the table. "Good morning, First Bank. This is Sarah," the woman replied. "Hello, Sarah. This is Ethan Wilson," he said. "I'm having a problem with joint credit cards. I suspect suspicious transactions." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wilson," Sarah said. "Give me the account number and I'll check." Ethan dictated a number he knew by heart. "I saw withdrawals I don't recognize. I want to freeze the cards to figure it out." "Sure," Sarah said, her keyboard clicking. "I can freeze both cards right now. Do you need to replace them?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "Just freeze it. I'll call when I figure it out." "It's done," Sarah said. "The cards are blocked. If you need anything else, call." "Thank you," Ethan said, hanging up. He returned to his laptop and logged into their bank account. The balance in the joint account, $127,342. Ethan opened the transfers page, his fingers moving quickly. He'd created a new account in his name at another bank, using the app he'd downloaded yesterday. Then he'd wired $50,000, about 40% of his liquid assets, to that account. It was a large enough sum to keep him safe, but not so large that Lindsay would immediately notice if she checked the balance. He confirmed the transfer by entering the code from the text message and exhaled. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. His heart was pounding, but not with fear, with determination. He felt like a traitor, hiding the money behind his wife's back, but her lies, lunch with Kate, the restaurant, Caleb, gave him the right. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. A neighbor was watering his lawn, cars were driving by. Denver was waking up, but for Ethan, the morning was different. He walked back to the table, picked up his phone, and typed Lindsay, "How's Pilates?" A minute later, the answer came, "Nice, going to Kate's now. We'll call later." Ethan clutched the phone, his fingers white. Another lie. He returned to his laptop, opened their investment portfolio, and began copying the data. He knew this was just the beginning. Lindsay was already moving money, and he needed to be faster. He worked for an hour, saving the statements until the sun rose higher, flooding the office with light. Ethan closed the laptop, finished his cold coffee, and headed for the living room. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer echoed through the unfinished guest room, each blow driving the nail deeper into the oak plank. Ethan's hands, rough and sure, gripped the tool tightly. Sawdust clung to his forearms, mixing with the sweat that beaded on his skin despite the October chill seeping through the open window. Building the cabinets was hard work, measuring, cutting, sanding, hammering, but it kept him going. The physical labor, the tangible progress, gave his mind the freedom to wander without falling off the rails. He always thought better when his hands were busy. Ethan paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, glancing at the frame of the closet taking shape against the wall. Sturdy, functional, durable. That was what he tried to be. The thought left a bitter taste in his chest, and he hammered another nail in, too hard, the wood creaking piteously. 6 years of marriage, countless sacrifices, his career in San Francisco given up for her advancement, evenings of cold dinners waiting for her return, and now Lindsay called it calculation. The word festered in him, sharp and bitter, like a splinter he couldn't pull out. The front door creaked downstairs, followed by the sound of rustling bags. Lindsay's heels clicked on the hardwood floor, a sharp, irritating rhythm that grated on his nerves. He didn't call out to her. Instead, he picked up another board, leveling it with the precision of a man accustomed to taming chaos. Her voice came from downstairs, high-pitched and artificial, as if she were speaking to an audience that didn't exist. "Ethan, are you up there?" she called out, with a slight but noticeable note of impatience. He didn't answer right away, letting the next blow of the hammer do the talking. Boom. He imagined the nail as her indifference, hammering it into submission. "Yeah," he finally muttered, loud enough for her to hear. In the guest room. Heels clicked on the stairs, slower now, deliberately. He kept working, not turning as she entered. The scent of her perfume, expensive, floral, with a slight chemical note, cut through the woodsy scent of sawdust. She paused in the doorway, and he felt her eyes appraising, but not on him. The room, the house, her investment. "Wow," she said with an approval that sounded rehearsed. "The cabinets are coming together. This house is really transforming." She stepped closer, the bags rustling as she set them down. "The living room is gorgeous too. I was telling Claire at brunch that if we do it right, we could sell this house for twice what we paid for it." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he kept his movement steady, sanding the edge of the board with slow, deliberate movements. Sell the house, of course. To Lindsay, it was all a deal, 6 years of his life reduced to a line item on a ledger. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes and glanced over his shoulder. "An investment in our future, huh?" The sarcasm was subtle, hidden in the tone, but she caught it. Lindsay's lips pressed together for a moment before she smoothed her expression down to neutral. She had a knack for that, papering over the cracks. "Exactly," she said, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear. "It's about being smart, Ethan. You know that." He turned back to the cabinet, his fingers tightening on the sandpaper. Smart. That's what she called it. Not heartless. Not selfish. He wanted to ask when she'd decided their marriage was just another asset to trade, but the question stuck in his throat. He nodded, letting the scraping of the sandpaper fill the silence. Lindsay didn't linger on the tension. She never did. She crossed the room, her heels clicking softly on the tarp, and leaned on the windowsill, looking out over the backyard. "I bought a couple of bags today," she said, almost absently. "From a boutique downtown. Limited edition. You wouldn't like them, too fancy." She laughed, and the laugh belonged to someone else's life. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to see the bags to know they were worth more than the pile of lumber in the corner. Limited edition. Another status symbol for a woman who no longer needed him, but still needed his reliability. He wondered, for the umpteenth time, if she had ever cared about the life they had planned together with children, a home that wasn't a commodity, a future built on more than ambition. The thought of children burned most. She had promised him a family when her eyes still warmed from his touch. Soon, she had said year after year, pushing it off for the next step in her career. He had waited, sacrificing his dreams, San Francisco, a startup, a life where he did more than hold her purse. Each compromise had taken a chunk out of him, and now, at 34, he was looking toward a future where those promises had turned out to be lies. He put the sandpaper down, clenching his fists before he forced them to relax. Control. That was his strength. He'd learned it early, in a house where outbursts of anger were met with no apology. He wouldn't be that person. Not with her, not with anyone. But damn, it was hard when she stood there, oblivious to the way her distance cut him like a blade. "Ethan," she said, softening her tone, but with calculation. "Are you okay? You've been quiet lately." He turned to face her, leaning against the workbench, arms crossed. Her eyes met his, but they were wary, as if she were bracing herself for an argument she didn't want. She wore a tailored blazer over a silk blouse, her makeup impeccable, her posture poised. She looked like a stranger playing the role of his wife. "I'm just thinking," he said quietly, reservedly, "a lot of things with the house, and with us." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't buy it. "With us?" she asked, tilting her head. "What's there to think about? We're all fine, aren't we?" Fine. The word was like a slap in the face. He wanted to laugh, to let the bitterness out, but he swallowed it. "Sure," he said, shrugging. "Fine." She frowned, sensing the lie, but didn't press. That was Lindsay's way, skirting the truth, keeping it clean. She glanced at her watch, shiny, probably worth as much as his truck. "I have a call with the team in 20 minutes. I'll be in the office if you need me." He nodded, turning back to the closet as she gathered her bags and left. The click of her heels faded, and the room felt larger, emptier. He picked up the hammer again, but the rhythm was gone. The blows were heavier, less precise, each a surge of something he couldn't name. Alone, he let his thoughts unravel. Had he loved the real Lindsay? The question gnawed at him, as persistent as the ache in his shoulders. He had fallen in love with her fire, her drive, the way she had made him believe that together they could do anything. But that woman was gone if she had ever existed. Maybe he had loved an image, a projection of who he wanted her to be. The realization was a quiet unraveling, as if the house he had built was crumbling under its own weight. He thought about the years he'd given up. San Francisco hadn't been just a job. It had been a chance to make his mark, to build something of his own. Every man wants that, doesn't he? A mark on the world, proof that he'd been here. Instead, he'd tied himself to her dreams, believing they were his. And the children she'd held that promise at arm's length, like a carrot. He could still hear her voice, soft and persuasive. "After this project, Ethan. After the next step." Now the words seemed like theft. The cabinet was almost finished, its lines clean and strong. He ran his hand over the wood, feeling the grain under his fingers. Good work, built to last. Unlike them, he stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans, and looked around the room. It was coming together the way Lindsay wanted. The perfect stage for her perfect life, the one in which he no longer had a place. He heard her voice from below, sharp and professional, discussing numbers with the team. She was in her element, untouchable. He wondered when she had stopped needing him, when the man who had built her world had become just another item to sell. The thought ignited a spark of anger, hot and reckless, but he pushed it down. Anger wouldn't fix anything. Nothing would. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and stepped out onto the back porch, the evening air cold against his skin. The yard spread out before him, overgrown but full of possibility. He wanted to build a swing set there for the children they would never have. The image lingered, vivid and painful, before he pushed it away. He took a long swig, letting the bitterness of the hops echo the one in his chest. Ethan sat at a corner table in a bar on the outskirts of town. He was fiddling with a bottle of beer, the label beginning to peel from condensation. The bar was nearly empty, just a couple of regulars at the counter and a bartender lazily wiping glasses. Ethan had chosen the place not for the atmosphere, but for the quiet and for Jack. Jack entered with the usual noise, the door slamming and his boots thundering across the floor. His broad frame filled the doorway, his shoulders squared as if he were still in uniform. His short hair, now streaked with gray, and the scar above his eyebrow that he had gotten in the same scrape as Ethan, betrayed their shared past. Jack grinned when he spotted Ethan and headed for the table, grabbing a chair and turning it around so it was facing the back. "Damn, bro, you look like you've been drinking with Charlie Sheen all night," Jack said, sitting down. His voice was husky, with that rough warmth that hadn't faded over the years. "What, Lindsay playing the queen again?" Ethan chuckled, but it was a forced smile. "Something like that. Glad you made it out." Jack waved the bartender over, ordered a beer, and leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan. "Got out? I was just waiting for you to call. You don't just call, Eth. What happened?" Ethan took a sip, feeling the cold bitterness of the beer slide down his throat. He didn't know where to begin. Jack wasn't just a friend, he was a brother in arms, the man who had pulled him out from under fire, and Ethan had done the same for him. They had shared the trenches, the fears, the black humor that had kept them alive. But talking about Lindsay, about his marriage falling apart, was harder than talking about the war. "It's all falling apart," he finally said, looking at the bottle. "Lindsay, she's not who she was. Or maybe I just didn't see who she really was." Jack's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Oh, so that's it. Welcome to the club, brother." He raised his bottle in a mocking toast. "My Carol thought I wasn't good enough when she found herself a lawyer with a shiny car. Divorce sucks, but freedom is worth it." Ethan nodded, but the word freedom stung. He wasn't sure if he wanted freedom or just to get back what he and Lindsay once had. "How did you cope?" he asked. "The divorce, the courts, all of it." Jack chuckled, taking a sip of beer. "Survive it. I hit her first, that's how. When I realized she was sleeping with that guy, I hired a lawyer, got the evidence. Didn't wait for her to fleece me." He leaned closer, his voice quieter but firmer. "Listen, life is a fight. If you don't hit her first, you'll get smashed. Find something to latch on to and hit her. She's already playing against you, believe me." Jack's words settled in Ethan's chest, heavy but true. He thought of Lindsay, her distance, her new bags, her talk of selling the house. She was already building a future that didn't include him. Jack was right. Waiting was losing. Ethan clutched the bottle, feeling his resolve harden like a steel rod in his spine. "I hired a man," he said quietly. "Reynolds, a private detective." Jack whistled, grinning. "That's my guy. Good job, Et. What's he dug up so far?" "I should have my first report today." Ethan glanced at the phone on the table. Jack clapped him on the shoulder, nearly knocking his beer over. "That's right. Find out everything you can. If she dumps you, be prepared. You're not the type to break down, Eth. Never have been." Ethan nodded, but something inside him twisted. He wasn't breaking, that was true. But every day with Lindsay took away a piece of who he was. He remembered sitting with Jack in a dusty barracks under the stars somewhere in the desert. They had talked about the future, about families, about homes, about a life where you didn't have to look death in the face every day. Ethan had believed in trust then, that if you kept your word, the world would reciprocate. Jack had laughed at his naivety, but he had his back anyway, just like now. "Remember that day in Kandahar?" Ethan asked, his voice growing quieter. "When we were pinned down against that ridge?" Jack snorted, but his eyes warmed. "Hell yeah, you pulled me out when I caught the shrapnel. We were a team, brother." Ethan stared at the table, the memory coming alive, vivid and sharp. The dust, the heat, the smell of blood and gunpowder. The screams, the roar of the engines. He saw Jack, bleeding but still firing, saw himself dragging him for cover, not caring if they would survive. It had been simple then. You either saved your own or you died trying. Loyalty wasn't just a word, it was everything. He'd carried it with him through the years, into his marriage, into his life with Lindsay. But she didn't know what it meant. "I thought it would be like this," he said, almost in a whisper. "That we would be a team." Jack shook his head, his expression serious. "Some people don't know loyalty at. They take while you give, and then they walk away. Don't blame yourself. You did everything right. She didn't." Ethan wanted to argue, to say that maybe he had made a mistake, but Jack's words rang true. He took a sip of beer, trying to push away the sadness that was clenching his chest. He missed those days, not the war, but the clarity, the feeling of having someone you trusted more than yourself. The phone on the table vibrated, the screen lit up. A message from Reynolds. Ethan froze, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment. Jack nodded, silently encouraging. Ethan unlocked the phone and opened the attachment. The first thing he saw was a photo. Lindsay, in her favorite black coat, leaving a cafe with a man. Caleb. Ethan recognized him immediately, Lindsay's coworker, the one she'd just talked about projects with. They were walking close, too close, her hand touching his elbow, a smile on her face that Ethan hadn't seen in months. The pain hit like a knife, sharp and sudden. He forced himself to breathe, scrolled further. The next file was a bank statement, a secret account in Lindsay's name. Transfers, large sums, going to things she hadn't told him about. The dates matched her business trips. Ethan gritted his teeth, his knuckles whitening on the phone. This wasn't just cheating. This was a pattern, a calculation. "Well?" Jack asked, his voice softer than usual. Ethan showed him the photo without a word. Jack whistled, shaking his head. "Bitch," he muttered. "Sorry, bro, but this is crap. What are you going to do?" Ethan stared at the screen, at Lindsay's smile, at Caleb's hand, at the numbers that screamed betrayal. The pain still burned, but underneath it, something else was growing, a cold, hard determination. He would not be the victim. He would not be the one crushed. "Strike first," he said, echoing Jack's words. "Like you said." Jack smiled, but there was more than just mockery in his eyes, there was pride. "That's my Ethan. Give her a run for her money, brother. You deserve better." They finished their beers, and the conversation turned to old stories about service, about stupid mistakes, about how they once stole a case of beer from the officer's mess. When they left the bar, the night was cold, the stars sharp in the darkski. Jack hugged him goodbye, clapping him on the back. "Hang in there, and call if anything happens. I've got your back." Ethan nodded, feeling the warmth of that old, unbreakable bond. "Thank you, Jack." The house was immaculate. The dining room table was set with a crisp white tablecloth, crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the scent of roast lamb and rosemary filled the air. Lindsay paced the living room, adjusting a vase of orchids and making sure everything looked perfect. Her movements were as precise as an actress about to go on stage. She was playing the role of the perfect hostess tonight, and Ethan, watching from the kitchen, felt like an extra in her performance. He sliced the baguette, the knife moving smoothly even as his insides seethed. Lindsay had insisted on this dinner for her coworkers to strengthen the bonds of the team. Ethan knew Caleb would be there. The photo Reynolds had given him, Lindsay and Caleb walking too close. Her hand on his elbow still burned into his mind. But he'd agreed to the dinner, not because he wanted to please, but because he wanted to see, wanted to know how far she'd come. The guests began to arrive. laughter, the clink of glasses, snatches of conversation about projects and deals. Lindsay was in her element. Her smile was bright, her voice flowed like honey, every word seemed carefully crafted. She introduced Ethan to her colleagues, "My husband, the jack of all trades," with a slight chuckle that could have been an endearment but sounded like a sneer to him. He smiled, shook hands, played the part, but his eyes were on her, and on Caleb. Caleb walked in last, with the easy confidence that comes with money and charm. Tall, in a navy suit, with neatly coiffed hair, he looked like a man accustomed to being the center of attention. His gaze swept the room, lingered on Lindsay just a little too long, and Ethan noticed. Noticed how Lindsay responded with a small smile, almost imperceptible, but too intimate for just a colleague. "Ethan, right?" Caleb said, holding out his hand. His voice was smooth as fine whiskey. "Lindsay's told me a lot about you. Nice house." Ethan shook his hand, squeezing it a little harder than necessary. "Thank you," he said, his tone even but his eyes cold. "Lindsay and I put a lot of work into this." Caleb nodded, but his smile was too smug, like he knew something Ethan didn't. It ignited a spark of anger in Ethan's chest, but he pushed it down. Not here, not now. Dinner had begun, and the table was alive with conversation. Lindsay was beaming as she bantered with her coworkers, her laughter ringing like a bell. Caleb sat across from her, and Ethan, seated at the head of the table, saw everything. Their glances caught in passing, her fingers lingering on her wine glass as Caleb spoke, his light touch on her wrist as he passed her a salad platter. Each gesture was a small betrayal, and Ethan felt his blood boil. But he held on. He smiled. He poured wine. He asked questions about work, pretending to care. He felt like a stranger in his own home. This table, this house, he had built it for her, for their future. And now she sat here, flirting with another man while he played host. Anger fought with the urge to stand, to knock over the table, to throw Caleb out the door. But Ethan was a master of control. He had learned it in war, where one false move could cost him his life. And now he was using it to get through this evening. Lindsay raised her glass, her eyes glittering. "To our team," she said, looking around the table. "And tonight, thanks for coming." Everyone joined in the toast, but Caleb was in no hurry to put his glass down. He stood up, shaking his wine slightly, and looked around the table with a charming smile. "To a wonderful evening. And to Lindsay," he said, placing special emphasis on her name. "For your hospitality, for your energy, it's infectious." Ethan slowly raised his glass, looking straight into Caleb's eyes. "To guests who feel at home, but still remember that they are guests," he said with a polite smile and a light tap of glass against glass. There was a moment of silence, the kind where you can't tell whether to laugh or hold your breath. Lindsay giggled nervously, and one of her colleagues laughed along, but there was something in Caleb's eyes, a hint of confusion, a thin crack in his confidence. Ethan sat up, his eyes still on Caleb. "Well, for the evening," he added calmly. He sipped his wine with that controlled calm that was more frightening than any outburst of emotion. Lindsay glanced at him, her smile faltering, but she turned back to her colleague, changing the subject. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable again, but Ethan knew he'd gotten under his skin, and that was good. As dinner wore on, the courses changed, the wine flowed, Ethan watched. He saw the way Lindsay leaned a little closer to Caleb when he made a joke, the way her hand would accidentally brush against his when she laughed, the way Caleb looked at her with a slightly possessive confidence that said he knew she was his. Ethan gripped his fork so tightly that the metal bit into his palm, but his face remained calm. He wouldn't let them see him hurt. He wouldn't let her win. As the guests began to leave, Lindsay walked them to the door, her voice ringing with gratitude. Caleb lingered, exchanging a few words with her at the threshold. Ethan stood in the living room, clearing away glasses, but his ears were hanging on every word. "It was a great night," Caleb said. "We should do it again," Lindsay said, her tone too warm. Ethan clutched his glass so tightly it almost cracked. When the door finally closed, Lindsay returned to the living room, rubbing her neck tiredly. "Well, that went pretty well," she said, not looking at him. "Thanks for helping." Ethan nodded, his voice even. "You're welcome." She glanced at him as if she wanted to say something, but instead picked up her phone from the table and headed upstairs. "I'm going to take a shower," she called over her shoulder. Ethan waited until the sound of her footsteps faded before he walked to the table. Her phone was there, the screen dark, but unlocked. She was always careless with that. His fingers hovered over the device. It was a risk. If she came down and saw, there would be a scene. But he had to know. He had to be sure. He picked up his phone, unlocked it, and opened his messages. Caleb's name was at the top of the list. Ethan gritted his teeth as he opened the conversation. The messages were short, but their tone said it all. "Today was fun. You were awesome," Caleb wrote. "Thank you. You didn't let me down either," Lindsay replied. "When again, just you and me. Soon, we need to choose the moment." Ethan felt the blood rush to his temples. He scrolled further, finding older messages, hints at meetings, jokes too personal, promises to be careful. Each word was a blow, but he forced himself to read until he reached the end. This wasn't just an affair. This was a parallel life she was leading behind his back. He took screenshots, sent them to himself, and deleted the traces, put the phone back, exactly in the same position, and went to the window. The night outside the glass was dark. The reflection of his face was pale and stern. He felt as if his home, his life, had been desecrated. The morning was gray, the sky outside covered with heavy clouds that promised rain. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the laptop in front of him glowing coldly. His fingers moved quickly, changing the passwords to his bank accounts, joint, personal, even an old investment portfolio he hadn't touched in years. Each click was a step toward protection, a brick in the wall he was building between himself and whatever Lindsay might take from him. He worked methodically, like a soldier checking his weapon before a fight. No emotion, just purpose. After the bills, he logged into his company's HR system, updating beneficiaries and contact information. Lindsay was no longer listed as the primary emergency contact. It was a small thing, but an important one, another knot he was untying. He didn't know how much time he had, but after dinner with Caleb and the messages he'd found on her phone, Ethan knew he couldn't wait. Jack was right. He had to strike first. Finished with his finances, he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The coffee in his mug had long since gone cold, but he took a sip anyway, feeling the bitterness settle on his tongue. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Lindsay was still asleep upstairs, or maybe she had already gone for her morning run. Her schedule was a mystery to him, as were her thoughts. He didn't know who she was anymore, but that didn't matter. He knew what to do. The phone vibrated, flashing the name of the lawyer Jack had recommended. Mr. Harris was direct, his voice like polished granite over the phone. Ethan outlined the situation: the marriage, the suspected affair, Lindsay's secret account, the photo with Caleb. Harris listened without interrupting, then gave clear instructions. Gather evidence, document everything, avoid confrontation. "Divorce is a game of chess, Mr. Davis," he said. "The winner is the one who thinks 3 moves ahead." Ethan wrote down his advice, feeling the cool confidence building inside him like a steel frame. He ended the call just as Lindsay came down to the kitchen. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, her workout clothes were tight, and she was holding a bottle of water. She looked fresh, energetic, as if last night's dinner and her flirtation with Caleb had been a dream he'd made up. "Good morning," she said, opening the refrigerator. "You're up early." Ethan closed the notebook where he'd been jotting down notes from Harris and smiled, just enough not to arouse suspicion. "Business," he said. "What about you? Jogging?" "Yeah, 5 kilometers. Gotta stay in shape." She got out the yogurt, sat down opposite him, and looked at him, her eyes clear but empty. "I'm working on a presentation today. Big deal, maybe a promotion. If everything goes well, it will change everything." Her voice was shaking with excitement, and Ethan nodded, feigning interest. That sounds serious. You can do it, he said, his tone warm but his insides as cold as ice. She'd spoken of the future, but she hadn't mentioned him. Not we, but I. It was further confirmation of what he already knew. She was building a life without him. Thank you, Lindsay said, smiling. It's important. I want everything to be perfect. I'm sure it will, Ethan said, standing up to pour himself more coffee. He turned his back to her, hiding the shadow that had crossed his face. Perfect. Like her lie, like her smile at Caleb. He fought down the flash of anger, reminding himself of the plan. Support her. Keep her from getting suspicious. Let her think she was in control. Lindsay went into the office, her laptop and papers already spread out on the table. Ethan watched her close the door and felt the house he had built become alien. He went back to his laptop, checking his email. A new message from Reynolds was waiting for him, with the subject line, Update. His heart quickened, but he opened the file with the same methodical precision he used to change passwords. Inside was more evidence. Another photo, Lindsay and Caleb in a car parked outside the hotel. Her hand was on his shoulder, their faces close too close for a business meeting. The next file was a recording of a call Reynolds had intercepted. Lindsay's voice, soft and playful, promised Caleb an evening he'll never forget. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The pain was sharp, but he forced himself to continue. The last file was updated statements from her secret account. Another transfer, a large one, to an account tied to Caleb. This wasn't just an affair. This was an investment in her new life. He closed his laptop, his breathing even, but inside he felt a storm. He felt a longing not just for Lindsay, but for who they had been. The memory came back unbidden, vivid and painful. Italy, 5 years ago. They were young, in love, their laughter echoing off the cobblestone streets of Florence. They sat on the Ponte Vecchio, the sun setting, the Arno River glittering gold. Lindsay pressed herself against him, her eyes shining, and she whispered, I will love you forever, Ethan. He believed her. He held her hand, feeling like the world was theirs. Now the memory was like a shard of glass in his chest. That Lindsay was gone, or maybe she had never existed. He didn't know what was worse, losing her or realizing he'd loved an illusion. But the longing didn't stop him. It only spurred him on. He wouldn't let it destroy him. Ethan sent Reynolds a quick text, dig deeper, whatever you find. Then he texted Harris, forwarding more evidence and asking him to prepare divorce papers. Each move was precise. He didn't feel happy, but he felt in control for the first time in months. Lindsay emerged from her office at lunch, her expression focused but pleased. The presentation's almost done, she said, pouring herself a water. If I get this promotion, we can, move on. Ethan looked at her, his smile a perfect mask. Move on, he repeated, nodding. Sounds like a plan. She didn't notice the irony in his voice. She never did. Exactly, she said, turning back to her laptop. This is going to be a new phase. Ethan watched her go and thought about his plan. A new phase. Yes, for him too. He wouldn't be the one left behind. He wouldn't be the one to break. He was a soldier, a builder, a man who survives. And now he will be the one who wins. He went back to working on the cabinets in the spare room, the hammer in his hand steady, each blow a promise. Reynolds' evidence, Harris's advice, Jack's words, all added up to a strategy. Lindsay thought she was playing chess, but she didn't see that Ethan was already moving his queen. He remembered her voice in Italy, her promise of eternal love, and for a moment his hand trembled. But he continued. Love was dead. Only the truth remained. Friday morning burst into the house, cold light filtering through the curtains. Ethan stood in the bedroom, watching Lindsay pack her suitcase. Her movements were quick, almost feverish, as if she were anxious to get away. She folded dresses, her laptop, her makeup bag, muttering something about working on a presentation at a hotel outside of town. Ethan knew it was a lie. The photo Reynolds had given her of Lindsay and Caleb in the car outside the hotel still burned in his mind. But he played his part helping her, his hands moving with mechanical precision, his face calm. "Here's your charger," he said, handing her the cable neatly coiled. His voice was even, but the sarcasm he'd been holding back stirred in his chest. "Don't forget, this is a serious presentation." Lindsay glanced at him briefly, her lips twitching into a smile that seemed genuine only on the surface. "Thanks, Ethan. You always come to the rescue." She tucked the cable into the side pocket of her suitcase and continued packing, unaware of the coldness in his eyes. He leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms. "The hotel, huh?" he asked casually. "The one with the lake view? Should be a quiet weekend. Perfect for work." Her fingers paused briefly over the zipper of her makeup bag, but she recovered quickly. "Yeah, exactly. It's quiet, no distractions." She turned to the mirror, adjusting her hair, her voice rising slightly, the way it always did when she was lying. "This presentation is my ticket to the top. If it works, it'll be a breakthrough." Ethan nodded, his smile thin as a blade. "A breakthrough," he repeated. "I'm sure you'll do the best you can." Inside, he was seething. Every word she said was part of a play she was putting on, unaware that he had already seen the script. He knew Caleb would be at this quiet hotel, knew about her secret account, knew about her plans for a future where he had no place. But he showed no anger. Instead, he took her coat from the rack and handed it to her, his movements almost caring. "Don't freeze out there," he said. "The weather's getting worse." Lindsay laughed as she took the coat. "You're like my mother," she teased, but there was no warmth in her eyes. She zipped up her suitcase, glanced at her watch, and added, "Okay, I'm going. I'll be back Sunday night. Don't be bored." "I'll try," Ethan said, and his tone was so light she didn't detect the venom in it. He walked her to the door, watching her get into the car, her silhouette disappear into the morning mist. The door closed and the house fell silent, but Ethan didn't feel empty. He felt triumphant. She'd driven away thinking she had everything under control, but he was the one holding the cards. He returned to his office, where his laptop was already open. The first thing he did was log into the bank and begin transferring assets. Joint savings, investment accounts, even a small inheritance from his father, everything he could protect. He moved into the trust he'd set up the day before with Harris's help. Lindsay was excluded as a beneficiary. Each transfer was like a hammer blow, driving a nail into her plans. He worked quickly but meticulously, checking every number, every step. This wasn't greed, it was survival. She'd already shown she was willing to take what she could. He wouldn't give her a chance. With the finances done, he contacted the notary to file a notice blocking the sale of the house. Lindsay had mentioned resale with the casual confidence that betrayed her intentions. The house was their shared asset, but Ethan was willing to fight for it. He had invested not just money, but years of labor into it, every nail, every cabinet, every sanded corner. She would not take that any more than she would take his dignity. Harris responded to his letter almost immediately, confirming that divorce papers were being prepared. "Keep her in the dark," he wrote. "The less she knows, the better your position." Ethan reread the words, feeling a cold confidence grow inside him like armor. He was a soldier, a strategist, and now he was fighting a war where every move mattered. But underneath the armor, the pain still throbbed. Lindsay's lies had cut deeper than he cared to admit. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the photo on the shelf of him and Lindsay in Italy. Florence, the Ponte Vecchio, her smile full of promise. The memory came like a tide, and he couldn't stop it. They were there, in their second year of marriage, full of hope. The sun was setting, painting the river gold, and Lindsay was pressed against him, her hair smelling of lavender. "I will love you forever, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking with sincerity. He believed her, holding her hand, feeling invincible. They talked about children, about a home, about the life they would build together. She was his team then, his home, his everything. Now the memory was like a knife twisting in a wound. He stood, walked over to the photograph, and ran his finger along the glass. Had he loved her then? Did he love her now? The questions burned, but the answers eluded him. Maybe he hadn't loved her, but the life they had promised each other. Or maybe she had always been like this, selfish, calculating, and he simply didn't want to see. Pain squeezed his chest, but he forced himself to move away. Nostalgia was a trap. He couldn't let it weaken him. His phone vibrated, startling him out of his thoughts. Another text from Reynolds. Ethan opened the attachment, his fingers moving with the precision of hammering nails. Inside was more evidence. Text messages between Lindsay and Caleb, screenshots of their weekend plans. Lakeside Hotel, room 312. Just us, Caleb had written. Can't wait, she'd replied, adding a smiley face that cut through Ethan like a splinter. Another file was a recording of their call, Lindsay laughing and promising to forget about work for those 2 days. Each new piece of truth was both fuel for his resolve and salt in the wound. He saved the files, forwarded them to Harris, and texted Reynolds, "Keep going. I want everything." Then he stood up, walked into the spare room, and picked up a hammer. The cabinets were nearly finished, their lines clean and solid. He hammered in a nail, then another, each blow an assertion of control. Lindsay thought she was running the game, but she was wrong. He was one step ahead. An inner voice whispered, "Aren't you too cruel?" He froze, the hammer hung in the air. The asset transfers, the lockdown, the evidence gathering, it was all calculated, cold. He didn't shout, he didn't break things, but his actions were weapons aimed at her future. For a moment, he wondered if he was becoming the man he hated, the man who destroyed rather than built. But then he remembered her lies, her hand on Caleb's shoulder, her secret account. She had started this war. He was only defending himself. He continued to work, but the question remained. Was it cruel to defend himself, or was it justice? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had to move forward. Gravel crunched beneath the tires of Ethan's truck as he drove down the narrow road toward the family cottage. The forest surrounded him on all sides, pine trees reaching up toward the gray sky, their branches swaying in the wind. The October air was cold, smelling of pine and damp, and Ethan rolled down the window, letting the wind whip his face. He hadn't been here in over a year, but the cottage had always been his sanctuary, a place to think, to breathe, to sort himself out. And now he needed it more than ever. The house came into view around the bend, a log structure with a sloping roof, surrounded by brambles and old oaks. He parked the truck at the porch, turned off the engine, and stood for a moment, looking at the peeling paint on the shutters. The cottage had been in his family since his grandfather's time, the place where he had spent his childhood, escaping the noise of the city, where he would later bring Lindsay when their love was young and full of promise. It seemed like a ghost of that life now, but Ethan came anyway. He needed clarity. He stepped inside, the old key creaking in the lock. The cottage smelled of dust and wood, the air stale but familiar. The wood floors creaked beneath his boots, the fireplace in the living room was cold, and the shelves were crowded with books and knickknacks that hadn't been touched in years. Ethan dropped his backpack on the couch and walked to the window that looked out onto the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the clouds, and he looked out at it, feeling the weight in his chest lighten a little. There was no Lindsay here, no lies, just silence and himself. He had come here for a reason. The escalation plan was working, the assets were in trust. The house was protected from sale, evidence was being collected, but inside Ethan, a storm was raging. Each new discovery about Lindsay, her texts with Caleb, her secret account, her weekend at the hotel hit him like a hammer. He was determined, cold, but somewhere deep down, there was still a love that smoldered, one he couldn't extinguish. He hated himself for it. The cottage was a place where he could confront that weakness and decide what to do with it. Ethan lit a fire in the fireplace, the old logs crackling, filling the room with warmth and the smell of smoke. He sat on the worn couch, sipping from a bottle of beer he'd brought from home. His gaze wandered around the room, catching on familiar details. The wooden eagle his father had carved on the mantel, the tattered blanket he and Lindsay had used to cover themselves when they'd slept here. Each thing whispered of the past, and he felt a melancholy tighten in his throat. He stood up to distract himself and began rummaging through an old dresser against the wall. It held family albums, letters, odds, and ends that no one had ever thrown out. His fingers found an envelope, yellowed with age, with his name written in Lindsay's neat handwriting. His heart sank. He pulled out the letter, unfolded it, and the familiar lines hit him like a memory he had been trying to bury. "Ethan, my Ethan," the letter began. "I'm writing this sitting in the cottage while you sleep. You snore, and it's so sweet that I can't help but smile. I want you to know how much I love you. You're my home, my anchor, the person with whom I want everything: children, laughter, even arguments, because with you they mean more than peace with anyone else. I'll never let you go. I promise. Yours, Lindsay." Ethan read the letter twice, his fingers tightening around the paper. It had been written 7 years ago, their first year here. Back then, when she had looked to him as the center of her world, and he had believed their love was unbreakable. Now the words were a mockery. He closed his eyes, feeling the weakness creeping in, the desire to believe that Lindsay was still out there. He could call her, ask what had gone wrong, beg her to come back. But then he remembered Caleb, her smile in that photo, her lies. The letter had been a lie, or maybe a truth that had died. He dropped the letter on the table, his breathing heavy. Melancholy was choking him, but he wouldn't let it win. He hadn't come here to give in. He had come to strengthen his resolve. Lindsay had chosen her path, and he would choose his. He grabbed a beer and stepped out onto the porch, the cold air cutting into his lungs. The lake lay before him, still as a mirror, and he remembered another day here with her. It was a picnic by the lake, early in the summer, when their marriage was still fresh. They spread a blanket on the grass, and Lindsay ate strawberries, laughing as the juice ran down her chin. She talked about the future of children running along this shore, of growing old together on this porch. "I want 3, she'd said, her eyes shining. 2 boys and a girl, and you'll teach them to build like you." Ethan had held her then, feeling that anything was possible. He'd seen their lives as clearly as the lake before him. The memory was ashes now, but it still stung. He went back inside, pushing the images away. His phone was on the table, the screen glowing with a new message from Reynolds. Ethan opened it, bracing himself for another blow. Attached was a bank statement, a transfer of $65,000 from Lindsay's secret account to another account linked to Caleb. The date was yesterday, just before she left for the hotel. Ethan gritted his teeth, anger flaring above the melancholy. This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft of his future, his trust, his life. He reread the details. The transfer was labeled as investment in a project, but Reynolds had added a note that Caleb's account was linked to an offshore company. Lindsay wasn't just preparing for a new life. She was financing it, using their money, their home, their years. Ethan felt his anger sharpen into something as sharp as a blade. The letter on the table now looked pathetic, a hollow shell of her promises. He wrote to Reynolds, "Find where the money is going, every penny." Then he forwarded the statement to Harris, adding, "This is urgent. We need to freeze her actions." His fingers moved quickly, but inside he was fighting. Part of him still saw Lindsay on that picnic, her laughter, her dreams. But another part, a larger part, saw the truth: a woman who lied, stole, betrayed. He couldn't let love blind him. Ethan stood up, walked to the fireplace, and threw a log on. The fire flared, devouring the wood, and he watched the flames, feeling his resolve strengthen. The letter had been a moment of weakness, but it would not change his plan. The cottage was silent, except for the crackling fire. Ethan sat, looking out the window at the lake. He had come here to find clarity, and he had found it. His love for Lindsay was a phantom, but his anger was real. The $65,000 wire was real. Her betrayal was real. His plan was real. He would not give up. He took the letter, held it to the fire, and watched as the paper curled up, turned black, and turned to ash. Ethan sat in his office, the cool light of his laptop screen casting on his face. Outside, rain drizzled, the drops pattering against the glass, creating a rhythm that calmed his nerves. He opened a new browser window, turned on incognito mode, and began typing. His fingers moved quickly, but each word was measured, like a bullet before it was fired. It was an anonymous tip to Lindsay's compliance department, hinting at financial improprieties related to her secret account and the transfer of $65,000 to an account linked to Caleb. He didn't mention names directly, but he provided enough detail, the dates of the transfers, the amounts, the offshore account to trigger an investigation. "Dear colleagues," he wrote, "please pay attention to potential irregularities in the financial activities of one of our employees. Transfers to third-party accounts not related to the company's projects may indicate a conflict of interest or misuse of funds." He reread the text, making sure that it was untraceable. It was not a punch to the forehead, but a pinpoint jab calculated to slow Lindsay down, to cast doubt on her impeccable reputation. Ethan knew that her promotion, her breakthrough, was hanging by a thread. This letter could cut him off. He hit send, and the screen flickered, confirming delivery. Ethan leaned back in his chair, satisfaction spreading through his chest like a swig of whiskey. This was his move, part of the chess game Harris had talked about. Lindsay had thought she was one step ahead in building her new life with Caleb, but she had been wrong. Ethan wasn't just a husband to push aside. He was a strategist, and now he was playing on her court. But the satisfaction was impure, tinged with guilt. Lindsay had worked for years for this promotion, sacrificing sleep, time, their marriage. He knew how much it meant to her. To destroy her dream, even if she deserved it, was like smashing something he'd once helped build. Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to push the thought away. She'd betrayed him. She'd chosen Caleb, the lies, the money. Why should he feel sorry for her? His phone vibrated, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mark, an old colleague who now worked at the same company as Lindsay. Ethan answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Hey, Mark. How are you?" "Hey, Ethan." Mark's voice was muffled, as if he were speaking from the corner of the office. "Listen, there's a lot of noise in the office. Someone snitched to compliance, and now they're reviewing the financial statements. They're saying it could affect Lindsay. Her promotion is on the line until they figure it out." Ethan clutched the phone, his heart racing, but he remained calm. "Really?" he asked, adding a note of surprise. "What kind of test?" "I don't know the details, but they're whispering that someone leaked the information about the strange transfers. Lindsay's team is under the microscope. She seems to be in shock. I saw her in the conference room. This morning her face was white as chalk." Mark paused, then added more quietly, "I don't want to pry, but are you okay with her?" Ethan let out a short laugh. "Same old business," he lied. "Thanks for telling me. Keep me posted if anything happens." "No problem," Mark replied. "Take care." Ethan hung up, his gaze falling to his laptop. The test had begun faster than he expected. He pictured Lindsay in her office, her blazer perfectly pressed, her confident smile that must now be cracking under the pressure. Satisfaction flared again brighter, but guilt clung to him like a shadow. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain. He hadn't done it out of malice. He had done it to protect himself, but he still felt dirty. The phone buzzed again, a text from Reynolds. Ethan opened the attachment, bracing himself for more evidence. Reynolds had written, "Lindsay was upset after the presentation. A source in the office says she was called into compliance. She met Caleb at a bar on Main Street later that evening. The conversation seemed tense." Attached to the message were photos of Lindsay and Caleb at a table, her face grim, his hand on her wrist. Another file was a recording of their conversation, intercepted through a boom mic. Lindsay's voice was shaking. "If this gets out, everything will fall apart. You have to help me, Caleb." His response was calm, almost indifferent. "We'll figure it out, but you have to be careful." Ethan clenched his jaw, anger flaring over his guilt. She'd run to Caleb, looked to him for salvation while her career was falling apart. It was further proof that he'd done the right thing. She hadn't just betrayed him, she'd built a new life using his money, his trust, his years. But now she was falling, and he was the one pushing her. He forwarded the files to Harris, adding, "This confirms the transfers. Use it for business." Then he wrote to Reynolds, "Keep an eye on Caleb. Want to know what he's planning." Each step was like a nail being driven into the plan he was building. But each step left a mark on his soul. He didn't want to be the man who crushed dreams, even if those dreams belonged to a traitor. The memory came flooding back, unbidden and vivid. 7 years ago, when Lindsay was working on her first collection for the company. She was an entry-level designer then, ambitious but unsure. Ethan remembered her sitting at the kitchen table, her sketches strewn about her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her eyes bright with exhaustion and hope. "I don't know if this is going to work, Ethan," she said one night, her voice shaking. He sat down next to her, took her hand, and said, "You can do it. You always do." He helped her, bringing her coffee, listening to her ideas, even cutting out cardboard cutouts for her presentation. When her collection was approved, she ran to him, laughing and crying, and said, "I couldn't have done this without you." Now the memory was like a knife. He had held her up, built her dreams, and she had cast him aside like a useless tool. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to push away the image of that Lindsay young, sincere, loving. She was gone, replaced by the woman who had lied, stolen, run to Caleb. But the guilt clung to him anyway. Ruining her career was fair, but it didn't make him happy. It was like burning down the house he had built. He walked into the guest room, where the cabinets were nearly finished. The hammer was on the workbench, and he picked it up, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. He drove a nail into the last shelf, each blow an affirmation of his resolve. Ethan turned back to his laptop, rereading Reynolds's message. Lindsay was upset, her promotion was in jeopardy, and she was looking to Caleb for comfort. It should have made him happy, but instead it left him feeling empty. He wanted her to feel the pain he felt, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure what he wanted. Victory, justice, or just closure. Sunday arrived with heavy skies, low clouds pressing down on the city, promising a storm. Ethan sat in the living room, his laptop open on the table, a folder of printouts, next to him statements, photos, notes from Reynolds. He waited for Lindsay, though he didn't know when exactly she would return. Her hotel weekend was supposed to end that evening, but after Reynolds's report on her distress and the compliance audit, Ethan sensed she might show up sooner. His plan was working. Her promotion was at risk, her secret account exposed, her assets transferred to a trust. He was ready for the final move, but he was still conflicted inside, exultation mixed with emptiness, anger with pain. The door slammed, and the sound of Lindsay's heels came through the door, sharp as a gunshot. She walked into the living room, her face pale, her eyes blazing with fury. Her suitcase was left by the door, her coat hanging over her shoulders as if she had forgotten to take it off. Ethan looked up, his posture calm, but inside he was tense, as if about to fight. "You," she spat, her voice shaking with anger. "You did this, didn't you? You ruined my career." Ethan closed his laptop, leaned back slowly, and looked at her. Her accusation had been expected, but her fury had hit harder than he thought. He forced himself to remain calm, his voice even almost cold. "What are you talking about, Lindsay?" She took a step closer, her hands clenching into fists. "Don't play dumb. I got suspended, Ethan. Compliance is digging into me because of some suspicious transfers. My presentation, my promotion, everything went to hell, and I know it was you. Who else could have snitched?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes hard, but his heart clenched. She stood before him, blazing with righteous anger, as if he were the villain and she the victim. But he knew the truth, and that truth was his weapon. He stood slowly, his movements measured, like a man who knew he held the trump card. "Are you blaming me?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "Maybe you should look at yourself, Lindsay, at your secret accounts, at your working weekends with Caleb, at the $65,000 you wired him. Do you want to talk about it?" Her face faltered, the rage turning to shock, as if he'd struck her. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck, and for a moment Ethan saw something like fear in her eyes. But she recovered quickly, her voice sharpening. "You were spying on me. You were going through my things. How dare you?" Ethan stepped to the table, picked up the folder, and opened it, laying the contents out in front of her. Photos of Lindsay and Caleb in the car, at the bar, outside the hotel, her bank statements, screenshots of their text messages. Each piece of evidence fell to the table like a death sentence. I wasn't spying, Lindsay. I was defending myself. You thought I wouldn't notice? You thought you could lie to my face, steal our money, build your new life while I played the loving husband? Lindsay stared at the papers, her breathing shallow. She reached for the photo, her fingers shaking, but stopped, as if afraid to touch the truth. It's not what you think, she said, her voice quieter, almost pleading. Caleb, he's just a colleague. We were working on a project. This money is an investment, Ethan. You've got it all wrong. Ethan laughed, but it was bitter, without joy. An investment? He picked up a screenshot of the conversation she'd written to Caleb about an evening he'd never forget, and tossed it in front of her. Is that what you call your hotel nights? Seriously, Lindsay, do you even believe that crap? She took a step back, her eyes darting around, searching for a way out. You don't understand, she began, but Ethan cut her off, his voice firmer. I understand everything, he said, leaning closer. I understand that you betrayed me. I understand that you used our marriage, our home, our money to build something with him. And you know what's funny? You told your sister that life is a struggle, that if you want more and better things, you have to play hardball. He paused, looking into her eyes. Well, Lindsay, I've learned to play by your rules. Her face went white, as if he'd ripped the air out of her. She knew he'd heard that conversation, her words, thrown at Mia with such cold certainty. Now they came back to bite her. Ethan, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm confused. We can fix this. We can. Fix it. He shook his head, his gaze cold, but inside he was hurting. You think it can be fixed? After everything you've done? I put the assets in a trust, Lindsay. The accounts are empty. The house won't sell, I've blocked it. Your plan is ruined, and so is my faith in you. She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears, but Ethan wasn't sure if she was crying from grief or defeat. You ruined everything, she whispered. My career, my life, how could you? How could I? His voice broke, and for a moment the mask of hardness cracked, revealing the pain he had been holding back for so long. You stole years from me, Lindsay. You promised me a family, children, a future, and instead you spent our money on your lover. Do you think I ruined your life? Look in the mirror. She winced, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't look away. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice hoarse. I loved you, Ethan. I don't know how it happened. Caleb was a mistake. I can explain it all. Ethan looked at her, and part of him, the part that still remembered her on the Ponte Vecchio, her laughter by the lake, her letter at the cottage, wanted to believe. Wanted to grab her, shake her, ask why she had destroyed everything they had built. But another part of him, the part that had seen the evidence, the part that had wielded her anger like a weapon, knew that her words were another lie. He stepped back, his hands balling into fists to keep himself from touching her. Your explanations mean nothing, he said quietly. You made your choice, and I made mine. Lindsay shook her head, her voice growing desperate. Ethan, please. We can start over. I'll leave the company. I'll break up with Caleb. We can be like we were before. I don't want to lose you. He looked at her, and the emptiness he felt was deeper than his anger. He was triumphant her career was in tatters, her plans were shattered, she was broken. But the victory was bitter. He felt no joy, only weariness. She stood before him, pleading, but he saw not his wife, but the stranger who had stolen his life. Like before, he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Do you think I can forget the way you lied to me, the way you looked at him, the way you spent our money on your new life? No, Lindsay, we're done. She began to sob, covering her face with her hands, but Ethan didn't move. He wanted to feel sorry, but all he felt was emptiness. He gathered the papers from the table, put them in a folder, and said, I'm filing for divorce. My lawyer will be in touch. You can stay here tonight, but tomorrow I want you out. Lindsay looked up, her eyes red, but with a spark of anger. "You can't just throw me out," she said. "This is my home too." "Not yours," he said, his voice hard as stone. "You sold it when you decided you didn't need me. Go away, Lindsay. This is the end." She looked at him, her face twisted in pain and despair, but she found no words. Finally, she turned, her steps hesitant, and went upstairs. Ethan heard the bedroom door slam and was left alone in the living room, surrounded by silence. He sat up, his hands shaking, but he forced himself to breathe. The victory was his, but it brought no relief. He thought of Lindsay, of her tears, of her pleas, and wondered if he had gone too far. He remembered her words to Mia. "Life is a struggle, and if you want more and better things, you have to play hard." He had played hard, as she had taught him. But why did he feel like a loser? Ethan looked at the picture on the shelf of them in Italy, laughing, happy. He stood up, picked it up, and laid it face down. He couldn't bear it anymore. Look at this. Love is dead, and all that's left is the truth. He won the battle, but the war left him empty. He opened his laptop and texted Harris. "She knows. Time to file." Monday morning arrived with a silence as heavy as the fog that had settled over the house. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a dampness and the smell of wet earth that filtered through the half-open window. Ethan stood in the living room, his hands still shaking from the confrontation the night before, but his face as hard as if carved from stone. Lindsay's suitcase lay on the table, the same one she had dropped at the door when she returned from her weekend at the hotel. He had not touched it, but now he picked it up, placing it by the door as a symbol of the end. She would leave today. It was not just his wish, it was inevitable. He stayed up all night, sitting in the living room with a bottle of beer, staring at the empty walls that had once been their home. Lindsay's footsteps came down the stairs, slow, hesitant. She walked into the living room, her eyes red from crying, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked less like the woman who had once glowed at dinner with her colleagues than like the Lindsay Ethan had loved. Her gaze fell on the suitcase by the door, and she froze, her lips trembling. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "You're just kicking me out?" Ethan looked at her, his face unwavering. "I gave you the night, Lindsay," he said, his voice even but firm. "But this house is not yours anymore. You made a choice, and I made mine. Take your things and go." She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, please," she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Enough," he said, his tone as sharp as a hammer. "I've heard your excuses. They don't change anything. You betrayed me, Lindsay. You stole everything from us, our future, our dreams, our marriage. I won't listen to you try to fix it. It's over." Lindsay stepped back, her shoulders slumping as if his words had physically hit her. She looked at the suitcase, then back at him, her gaze full of pain, but Ethan didn't look away. He had no doubt. Not now, when the truth was clear as day. She had ruined their lives, and he wouldn't let her stay to finish what was left. "Where do I go?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I have nothing, Ethan. You took the bills, my career. What do I do?" Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling her words scrape at him, but he didn't give in. "Go to Mia," he said. "You've always been close to her. Or Caleb, since he's so important to you. But not here. This is no longer your place." She flinched at the sound of Caleb's name and looked down. "I didn't," she began, but stopped, knowing that any words were useless. She walked slowly toward the suitcase, her movements mechanical, like someone who had lost everything. She picked up the pen, but paused, looking at Ethan. "I loved you," she whispered. "I really did love you once." Ethan felt the pain tighten in his chest, but he didn't show it. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but it wasn't enough. Goodbye, Lindsay." She stood there for a moment, her eyes searching him for something: forgiveness, weakness, hope. But his face was unreadable, and she finally turned away. The door opened, cold air rushed into the house, and Lindsay stepped out, dragging her suitcase behind her. Ethan watched her get into the car, her silhouette disappear into the fog, and he didn't move until the sound of the engine faded. She was gone. To Mia, to Caleb, anywhere it was none of his business anymore. The house felt empty, the silence like a physical weight. Ethan closed the door and walked slowly around the living room, his gaze sliding over familiar things. The table where he'd eaten dinner with her coworkers, the fireplace where he'd burned her letter, the shelves where the photograph of them from Italy still sat, now face down. This was his home, but it felt foreign, as if Lindsay had taken his essence with her, leaving only a shell behind. He walked into the bedroom, where her scent lavender and expensive lotion still lingered in the air. The bed was unmade, her pillow rumpled, as if she'd spent the night clinging to the last moments of their life. Ethan began cleaning, mechanically, like a soldier cleaning his weapons after a battle. He gathered up her forgotten belongings, a hair clip, a single earring, a tube of lipstick, and dropped them into a box. Each item was a fragment of their past, and he wanted to get rid of them so he could move on. In the closet, he came across an old t-shirt of hers, faded and with a college logo on it, the one she'd worn around the house in their early years. Lindsay had loved to sleep in it, claiming it was more comfortable than any pair of pajamas. Ethan picked it up, the fabric soft and worn with age, the scent of her perfume still clinging to the fibers. He paused, his fingers curling into the fabric, and the memories came flooding back like a wave. He saw her in that shirt, laughing in the kitchen while they had a picnic by the lake, dreaming of children, of a future. He saw her in that shirt at the cottage, writing him a letter full of love. He saw her in that shirt their first year of marriage, dancing in the rain, not caring if they got wet. Each memory was like a blow, and Ethan felt tears sting his eyes. He sank down on the bed, clutching the shirt, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to cry. The tears came quietly, without sobbing, but they carried with them all the pain he had been holding back. He mourned their marriage, their dreams, the woman he loved. He mourned the years he had given believing in her, and the years she had stolen with her lies. He mourned himself, the man he had been, and the man he had become. The victory was his, but it was empty. Lindsay was gone, her career ruined, her plans thwarted, but Ethan felt no joy. He felt only sadness, deep as the lake by the cottage where they had once been happy. He had no doubt about his decision. Lindsay leaving was the right thing to do, the only way out. She had betrayed him, and he had defended himself like a soldier, like a builder, like a man who doesn't break. But that didn't make the pain any less. He held the t-shirt, his tears soaking into the fabric, and he allowed himself this moment of weakness. Tomorrow he would get up, continue to deal with the divorce, with the house, with his life. But today he mourned. The conference room smelled of coffee and paper, its glass walls reflecting the gray light of a November morning. Ethan sat at a long table, his lawyer, Harris, to his right, a folder of evidence neatly laid out in front of him. Across from him sat Lindsay with her lawyer, a woman in a sharp suit whose eyes slid over the documents with professional coolness. Lindsay looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, her hands fiddling nervously with her pen. Ethan watched her, feeling the weariness that settled in his bones, but also a sense of justice that kept him on his toes. These were divorce negotiations, a chess game in which he held the queen. Harris began, his voice as level as granite. My side proposes a division of assets that takes into account Mr. Davis's premarital contribution and his efforts to protect the estate. Given the evidence of Miss Wilson's financial improprieties, including the transfer of $65,000 to an outside account, we request that she relinquish her claim to the house and the principal savings. Lindsay's lawyer, Miss Clark, narrowed her eyes. These allegations have not been proven, she countered. My client is entitled to an equal division. The house and the accounts are marital property, and her contribution to the marriage cannot be ignored. Lindsay leaned forward, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. I worked as hard as you did, Ethan. I deserve half. You can't just take it all because of my mistakes. Ethan looked at her, his face unreadable, but inside, pain stirred. Her word, mistakes, had cut like a knife. Cheating, lying, stealing their future, these weren't just mistakes. but he didn't let the emotion spill out. "Mistakes?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. "You call cheating on Caleb a mistake? Transferring our money to his account? Planning a life without me? Those aren't mistakes, Lindsay. They're choices." She winced, her eyes shining, but she quickly looked away. "I don't," she began, but her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "Let's focus on the facts," Clark said. "We have no evidence that these transfers were illegal. Miss Wilson claims they were investments in the project. You can't use unsubstantiated allegations to deprive her of her rights." Harris smiled, but it was a cold smile. He opened the folder, laying out the statements, photos, and correspondence. "We have evidence," he said. "Bank transfers, intercepted messages, evidence of meetings between Miss Wilson and Mr. Caleb Reed. If this goes to trial, these documents will be turned over to her company's compliance department, which will likely end her career." Lindsay paled, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her pen. "You won't do this, Ethan," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You're not like that. You won't destroy me." Ethan looked at her, and fatigue washed over him like a wave. He didn't want to be the man who destroyed. He wanted justice, but not revenge. He remembered her at the cottage, her laughter by the lake, her old t-shirt that made him cry. Part of him still saw that Lindsay, but he knew she was gone. He had no doubt in his plan, but he didn't want her to be completely destroyed. "I don't want your career, Lindsay," he said, his voice firm but calm. "But I won't let you take away what I've built. You made a choice, and now you're paying for it." She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "I know I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I shouldn't have, with Caleb, with the money. I messed up Ethan. I thought I could have more, but I lost everything. I'm sorry, I really am." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Ethan felt the old pain flare in his chest. He wanted to believe her, but her regret came too late. He shook his head. "Regret doesn't change the facts," he said. "You betrayed me, Lindsay. You wanted more and better, like you told Mia. Now you see where that led." She hung her head, tears falling on the table. Her lawyer cleared her throat, trying to get the negotiations back on track. "We're willing to discuss a compromise," Clark said. "Miss Wilson is willing to give up the house if she's given a portion of the savings and no further compliance charges." Ethan looked at Harris, who nodded slightly. It was a reasonable deal, but Ethan wanted more not for himself, but for justice. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Lindsay. "I'll give you some of the savings," he said, "but the house is mine, and I won't keep quiet about your actions if you try to play against me. This is your final warning." Lindsay nodded, her face a mixture of despair and resignation. "Okay," she whispered, "I agree." Harris began to draw up the preliminary agreement, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling the fatigue pressing on his temples. The negotiations were a step toward the end, but he didn't feel relieved. He wanted balance to punish her, but not destroy her. After the meeting, he contacted her company's compliance through an anonymous channel, clarifying that the violations were related to Lindsay's personal finances, not her professional activities. It might save her career, or at least give her a chance to start over. He didn't know why he did it, maybe to avoid becoming what she accused, maybe to leave a grain of humanity for yourself. When the negotiations were over, Lindsay walked out without looking at him. Her lawyer gathered up the papers, giving Ethan an appraising look. Harris clapped him on the shoulder. "Good job," he said. "We're ready for the next step. The court will approve the agreement, and you'll be free to go." Ethan nodded. Ethan sat on an old wooden chair in the backyard, his hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. Night had fallen over the Rocky Mountains, their dark silhouettes silhouetted against the starry sky, sharp and majestic as sentinels. The cold Colorado air bit at his skin, but Ethan remained still, letting the wind snake under his flannel shirt. The house was warm behind him, the light from the kitchen window spilling onto the grass, but inside he felt empty, not oppressive, but strangely liberating. This was his home, his fortress, won in a war that had cost him more than he could count. The yard was overgrown, but full of memories. He'd seen Lindsay here, laughing as they planned to plant maples, or sitting in this same chair with a glass of wine, talking about her dreams. Back then, he'd believed their life would be as solid as these mountains. Now she was gone, leaving behind the echoes of her lies and his pain. Ethan sipped his coffee, his gaze darting to the stars, and let himself think of her, not the woman who had betrayed him, but the one he loved. His love for Lindsay still burned inside him, like embers smoldering beneath the ashes. He hated her for it, but hatred was useless. He'd seen her in Italy, on the Ponte Vecchio, her eyes full of promise. He'd seen her in the cottage, in an old t-shirt, laughing at his jokes. These images were a part of him, carved into his heart like patterns on wood. But he had changed. The Ethan who trusted blindly, who had built their future on her words, had died somewhere between her betrayal and his victory. The new Ethan was watchful, cautious, a man who knew the price of betrayal. He didn't regret his decision. The divorce was the right one. Colorado's equitable division laws had given him his house, most of his savings, a chance to start over. Lindsay had gotten her share, enough to keep her off the streets, but not enough to live the life she'd planned with Caleb. Her career was in jeopardy, but Ethan had softened the blow by limiting the charges to her personal finances. He'd done it not for her, but for himself, to avoid becoming the kind of man who destroyed for revenge. Justice, not cruelty, was his anchor. But justice did not fill the void. The house was his, but without her laughter, without her footsteps on the hardwood floors, it seemed too big. The cabinets in the guest room he had finished last week were perfect, solid, smooth as his will. But they were empty, like his heart. Ethan looked at the mountains, their stillness comforting, a reminder that time heals, even if scars remain. He had mourned their marriage, but the tears had dried. Now he looked forward, and there was hope in it, tentative but alive. He thought about the past, about the years he had given up for Lindsay. He had given up his job in San Francisco for her career, waited for her with dinners that grew cold, dreamed of the children she had promised but put off. These sacrifices had made him who he was, but they had also taught him strength. He had stood firm, not broken by her lies, not drowned in anger. He had built a plan the way he had built cabinets, step by step, with precision and patience. Jack, Reynolds, Harris, they had been his allies, but the victory was his. He had been a warrior as well as a victim, and it had changed him. The stars overhead twinkled, their light cold but constant. Ethan felt part of the night, part of the mountains, part of a world that kept moving despite his losses. He no longer trusted the way he once did. Vigilance had replaced blind faith, and that was a good thing. He didn't want to be that naive man who saw more in Lindsay than she was. But he didn't want to be a cynic like Jack, closed to all that was new. Somewhere in the middle was his new life, and he was ready to find it. He remembered what she had said to Mia. Life is a struggle, and if you want more and better, you have to play hard. She had been right, but she had played the wrong game. Ethan had played hard, but not for more and better. He had played for himself, for the right to live without lies, and he had won. The house behind him was proof of that, not just walls, but a symbol of his strength, his ability to build even after destruction. Ethan finished his coffee, the mug cold in his hands. He stood, his boots crunching on the grass, and turned to look at the house. Light from the windows spilled into the yard, illuminating the half-finished fence he planned to finish. This was his project, his future. He didn't know what it would bring: new love, family, or just peace. But he was ready to find out. He went back into the house, put the mug in the sink, and came out again, grabbing a blanket from the couch. He sat in a chair, covered himself, and looked up at the stars. The Rockies were silent, but their presence was comforting. The house behind him stood as strong as his resolve. Ethan was alone, but not lonely. He was transformed, but not broken. The melancholy was still there, but hope burned brighter. This was a new dawn, and he was ready to meet it. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.